when a hungry little black girl stood up in the middle of court and interrupted one of the strictest judges in town, no one knew what to think. At first, there was silence. Just the sound of the gavel slamming down, followed by the soft rustling of papers and the whispers from the audience. But what happened after that? It didn't just change her mother's life, it changed the judge himself. This is the story of a single mother, a hungry child, and a judge who everyone believed had a heart made of stone. But sometimes, even the hardest hearts crack. All it takes is the right moment. The courtroom was tense that morning. Nia stood there, hands shaking slightly, her heart racing. Her 6-year-old daughter Maya stood beside her, holding on to her mother's skirt. Behind the enormous wooden desk sat Judge Callisto, the kind of judge who didn't care about excuses. In his court, rules were rules, no matter who you were or what your story was. Nia had heard about him before. Cold. Harsh. Unforgiving. That's why her stomach churned when she stood there, waiting for him to speak. The whole room held its breath, watching, because once Judge Callisto made up his mind, there was no turning back. No one could have guessed that a hungry little girl was about to change everything. To understand why Nia stood in that courtroom, shaking in front of Judge Callisto, you have to understand who she was, and what life had put her through. Nia was a single black mother, raising her daughter Maya on her own. Life for her was never simple, never easy. Every morning was a race, not just against the clock, but against bills, deadlines, and a world that didn't stop for anyone. Her days started before the sun came up, ironing uniforms, packing school bags, searching for missing shoes. Then rushing Maya off to school, only to run straight to her first shift at the bakery. By the time she clocked out, she barely had time to breathe before starting her second job waiting tables. Even after all that, the bills never slowed down. Rent was overdue. The light bills sat on the counter. Groceries were carefully rationed. And every unexpected expense, like a parking ticket, felt like a punch to the stomach. But none of this was the hardest part of Nia's story. The hardest part was the betrayal, the kind that leaves scars nobody can see. Years ago, when Maya was just a toddler, Nia believed she had someone to lean on. Darius, the man she loved, the father figure Maya needed. He promised her a future, said they would build a life together. She trusted him with her dreams, and her savings account. But one morning, Nia woke up to find Darius gone. Every dollar she had saved for her and Maya's future was empty from her account. And the worst part? He didn't leave alone. He ran off with Nia's own sister. That betrayal broke something inside Nia. It left her not just broke, but feeling like a fool, like the world was laughing at her for ever believing she could have something stable. And yet Nia didn't stop. She worked harder, cried quietly at night, and promised herself that no matter what, Maya would never feel abandoned the way she had. That's why Nia ended up in court that day. Her only crime? Trying to get her daughter the medicine she needed. It all started with a cough. That morning, Maya had woken up with a scratchy throat and a runny nose. Nia knew the signs, a cold was coming. Normally, she would have already had medicine at home, but money had been too tight to stock up. So, instead of heading straight to work, Nia made a quick detour to the pharmacy. She knew she was running late, but Maya came first. When they pulled into the parking lot, every regular spot was full. The only open space was a handicapped spot right by the door. Nia knew better. She knew parking there was illegal. But in that moment, all she could think about was her daughter, sniffling in the back seat, eyes droopy with exhaustion. "It'll only take a minute," she told herself. In and out. Her heart pounded as she ran through the automatic doors. Every second in that store felt like a race, rushing to the shelves, fumbling through her purse for the exact change, glancing at the clock on her phone again and again. Minutes stretched longer than they should. The line at the pharmacy counter crawled forward. Nia tapped her foot, panic rising with every passing second. When she finally stepped back outside, medicine in hand, her stomach dropped. Tucked under her windshield wiper was a bright orange ticket, bold letters spelling out the price of her mistake. $200. $200 might be nothing to some people. But to Nia, it was groceries for 2 weeks. It was gas to get to work. It was the difference between keeping the lights on or sitting in the dark. She stood there in the cold morning air, staring at that ticket, feeling like the whole world had just taken one more swing at her, and this time, it landed right in her gut. All because she dared to choose her daughter's health over a parking rule. The day of the hearing came faster than Nia was ready for. The courthouse stood like a giant gray wall against the sky, cold and uninviting. As Nia pushed open the heavy glass door, the air inside felt even colder. The floors gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and the sound of shoes echoing down the long hallway made everything feel more serious than it should. At the security checkpoint, Nia fumbled with her purse, her hands shaking slightly as she emptied her pockets into the plastic tray. The guard barely looked at her as he waved her through the metal detector. No smiles. No warmth. Just procedure. Maya clung to her hand, her small fingers squeezing tight as they walked toward the courtroom. Nia could feel the tension in her own shoulders, but she forced a smile for her daughter, the kind of smile moms wear even when their whole world feels like it's falling apart. Inside the courtroom, it was dead silent except for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional cough from the audience. Everything felt too big, the desks, the walls, the judge's towering chair at the front. And there he was, Judge Callisto. His reputation had reached Nia long before she ever stepped into his courtroom. Everyone knew his name. He was the judge who never bent the rules, never cared for excuses, and never showed mercy. People said his heart was made of stone, that he handed down fines and sentences like they were nothing more than math problems. Nia's throat tightened as she stood there, knowing that this was the man who would decide her fate, a man known for following the law, not understanding the struggle. She felt Maya's little hand squeeze tighter, grounding her for just a second. That tiny hand was the reason she was here, the reason she parked in the wrong spot, the reason she couldn't afford to just pay the fine and move on. For Maya, she would stand in front of any judge, no matter how terrifying. But deep down, Nia feared that Judge Callisto wouldn't see a mother trying her best. He would only see a rule breaker. And in his courtroom, rules were all that mattered. Nia stood there, hands clasped in front of her, knuckles turning white. Her heart hammered in her chest as she took a shaky breath, trying to find her voice. "Your Honor," she started, her voice barely louder than a whisper. I know parking in a handicapped spot was wrong. I didn't have a choice that morning." She stumbled through her explanation, how Maya had woken up sick, how they were already late, how every regular spot was full and she thought she'd only be inside for a minute. Her words tumbled out, rushed and uneven, like she was afraid the judge would cut her off before she could explain the whole truth. Judge Callisto sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. He didn't nod, didn't frown, didn't give even the smallest sign that he cared about a single word Nia was saying. Nia's stomach twisted. She could feel the weight of his silence, and it made her explanation feel smaller and smaller. All around her, she could hear faint whispers from the audience, strangers quietly passing judgment, some shaking their heads, others watching like they were waiting for her to fail. Nia's voice cracked as she said, "I'm just trying to take care of my daughter. That's all." Judge Callisto didn't even blink. The silence was suffocating, stretching so long that Nia felt like her heart might burst just from the waiting. And then, out of nowhere, a tiny voice rang out, loud and clear. "Mommy, can we get hamburgers after this?" The courtroom gasped. Heads turned, jaws dropped. Nia froze, her face burning with embarrassment. Her heart sank into her stomach as she glanced down at Maya, who stood there completely unaware of the chaos she just caused. Normally, people might have laughed at the innocent comment. But not here. Not in Judge Callisto's courtroom, a place where humor had no home and interruptions were unforgivable. Nia could barely breathe. Her mind raced. Had Maya just ruined everything? All eyes turned back to Judge Callisto, waiting to see what he would do. Nia braced herself for the worst. For a moment, the room stood still. Everyone expected the gavel to slam, for Judge Callisto to raise his voice, for him to remind everyone that his courtroom was no place for interruptions, especially not from a child. But none of that happened. Instead, the stern lines on his face softened, just a little. His eyebrows lifted, not in anger, but in curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "Did you say hamburgers?" he asked, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard from him before. Maya nodded, her small face completely serious. "Yes, sir." "Why are you so hungry, sweetheart?" the judge asked. Maya's answer came without hesitation. No filter, no rehearsed excuse, just pure, innocent honesty. "Because Mommy works a lot. She was rushing this morning, so we didn't have time for breakfast." The room fell completely silent again, but this time, it felt different. Nia's throat tightened, her eyes stinging. She wanted to explain, to soften the truth, to protect Maya from the weight of their reality. But her daughter had already said it all. To Maya, there was nothing embarrassing about it. This was just their life, the rushing, the forgetting, the long hours, the empty fridge on bad weeks. To her, her mom was simply someone who worked hard all the time, doing everything she could to make sure Maya had what she needed. That kind of raw truth doesn't come from adults. It only comes from kids too young to know they're supposed to hide their struggles. And for the first time that day, maybe for the first time in a long time, Judge Callisto didn't see a rule breaker standing before him. He saw a mother trying her best. And he saw a little girl who just wanted breakfast. Something changed in that moment. The man who had been sitting stiffly behind that massive desk, a judge feared for his cold, unshakable rulings, suddenly didn't seem so distant. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, his hands folded together, as he looked directly at Maya. Not the way adults usually glance at kids, but really looked like he was trying to understand her world. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. This towering man in his black robe, and this tiny 6-year-old girl in scuffed shoes, standing there with wide eyes and an empty stomach. "I see," the judge said softly, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "And does your mom always work that hard?" Maya nodded. "She makes cakes and cookies at the bakery. Sometimes she works at the restaurant too. That's why she's so tired." Nia's face burned with quiet shame, not because of Maya's words, but because the truth sounded so stark, so exposed, when spoken out loud. The judge sat back for a moment, almost as if he needed to absorb it all. His fingers tapped against the arm of his chair, a small habit people do when they're thinking deeply, the kind of thinking that changes minds. Even the audience could feel it, the shift in energy, the sense that something rare was happening in that courtroom. It was as if Maya's honesty had cut through the walls the judge had spent years building around himself. Because sometimes, it doesn't take long speeches or legal arguments to move a person. Sometimes, all it takes is the truth from a child too young to know how to hide it. And in that quiet moment, the courtroom learned a lesson that couldn't be found in any law book. Even the toughest hearts can soften when innocence speaks. The judge looked back at Maya, his voice still soft. "Can you tell me more about your mom?" Maya's face lit up, proud to talk about the person she loved most. "She works all the time," Maya said. "She wakes up really early to make cakes at the bakery. Sometimes I help her frost the cupcakes if I'm not too sleepy." The courtroom smiled softly at that, but Maya wasn't done. "And at night sometimes she works at a restaurant too. She says it's so we can have our own place and not have to move again." Nia closed her eyes for a second, swallowing hard. Maya's innocent words were pieces of a much bigger story, a story Nia had never expected her daughter to share with strangers. But the truth was out now. What the judge didn't know, what nobody in that room could have guessed, was how Nia's life used to look. Years ago, before the bakery shifts and the restaurant tips, before she carried every burden on her own, Nia had dreams. She was saving for college, hoping to become a teacher. Back then, she believed life would be stable, because she wasn't alone. She had Darius. He was supposed to be her partner, her rock, the father figure Maya needed. For years, she trusted him, until the morning she woke up and everything was gone. Her savings account emptied. Her heart shattered. And Darius? He didn't just disappear. He ran off with Nia's own sister. That betrayal didn't just break Nia's trust, it stole her future. With no money, no backup plan, and a daughter to raise alone, Nia gave up on her own education and stepped into survival mode. Every dream she once had was replaced by the simple fight to get through each day, working long shifts, making just enough to scrape by, always one unexpected bill away from disaster. The audience listened in silence, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing how quick they'd been to judge her for a parking ticket, without knowing the weight she carried every single day. The judge listened too, and for the first time, he wasn't just hearing about a fine. He was hearing about a life built on strength, sacrifice, and a love so fierce that Nia was willing to stand in front of a courtroom, terrified, just to fight for her daughter's future. Maya didn't know all the details. She didn't know about the betrayal, the heartbreak, the nights Nia cried herself to sleep. All Maya knew was that her mom never gave up, no matter how hard things got. And sometimes, that's all the truth you need. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression softer than anyone had ever seen in that courtroom. He looked at Maya again, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Tell me something, young lady," the judge said. "Since your mom broke the parking rule, what do you think her punishment should be?" The room went completely still. Nia's heart stopped for a second, unsure if this was some kind of trick, or if the judge was actually asking her 6-year-old for legal advice. Maya tilted her head, thinking hard, her little brow furrowed in concentration. Then, she gave the kind of answer only a child could give, honest, simple, and far wiser than anyone expected. "You're the judge," she said, shrugging. "You know best." For a moment, silence hung in the air, and then, unexpectedly, laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge couldn't hold back a smile, shaking his head at the sheer innocent brilliance of her reply. That single moment, so pure, so unfiltered, cracked the heavy tension that had filled the room since Nia walked in. And in that laughter there was something deeper. A reminder that sometimes, the purest souls teach us the greatest lessons, that justice isn't always about rules and punishments. Sometimes, it's about understanding the story behind the mistake. The judge sat quietly for a moment, hands folded under his chin, his gaze shifting from Nia to Maya and back again. The room waited, breath held, hearts pounding, everyone wondering if this unexpected softness would fade, if the old, rigid Judge Callisto would return and hand down the harsh fine everyone expected. But instead, the judge took a deep breath and spoke. "Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice calm but clear, "after hearing your story and understanding the circumstances, I'm dismissing this case." Gasps filled the room, quickly followed by applause. Even people who had nothing to do with Nia felt their eyes sting, their hands clapping instinctively, as if they knew they'd just witnessed something rare and beautiful. Nia's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the table for support, barely able to believe what she'd heard. Tears filled her eyes, not just from relief, but from the sheer weight being lifted off her shoulders. But the judge wasn't done. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and handed it directly to Nia. "This," he said, "is a list of resources for single mothers in this county. Programs that offer free childcare, job training, and even online degree programs. I hope you'll use them, because you deserve more than just survival." Nia took the paper with trembling hands, her voice too shaky to speak. This wasn't just kindness, this was a lifeline. For years, Nia had felt like she was drowning, barely keeping her head above water. But for the first time in as long as she could remember, someone had reached down and offered a hand. The judge looked at Maya once more, smiling gently. "And young lady, I hope you and your mom get those hamburgers today." The courtroom filled with soft laughter again, but this time, it felt different, lighter, warmer, filled with hope. Justice, the judge had shown, isn't just about punishment. Sometimes, it's about understanding the story behind the mistake, and choosing compassion over rules. For Nia, life didn't change overnight, But that one small piece of paper, handed to her by a judge known for being heartless, became the start of something she never expected, a second chance. With the list of programs Judge Callisto gave her, Nia found free childcare, something she never thought she could afford. With Maya safely looked after, Nia was finally able to cut back on one of her shifts and enroll in an online college program, the very dream she had given up years before. The late-night shifts slowly became evening study sessions. The bakery job stopped being just survival, and started becoming a stepping stone to something better. For the first time in years, Nia wasn't just fighting to survive, she was building a future. And Maya? She got to see her mom not just as someone exhausted from work, but as someone excited about learning again, someone who showed her, day by day, what strength really looks like. But Nia wasn't the only one who changed. Word of what happened in Judge Callisto's courtroom didn't stay inside those four walls. Someone in the audience posted about it online, and within days, Nia's story went viral. News outlets picked it up. People across the country couldn't believe that the toughest judge in town had shown such unexpected compassion, all because of a hungry little girl and a simple question about hamburgers. Even the judge himself became a symbol of change, proof that no matter how strict the rules, there's always room for understanding. And for millions of people who heard Nia's story, it became a reminder of something we all forget sometimes, that kindness doesn't cost much, but it can change someone's whole life. Sometimes, it takes just one person to stop seeing someone as a case file and start seeing them as a human being. And when that happens, lives can change forever. This story reminds us all, in a world obsessed with rules, sometimes the bravest thing a judge can do is listen. And sometimes, the smallest voice in the room can teach us the biggest lesson. Have you ever witnessed unexpected kindness in a place you least expected it? Share your story in the comments, because your voice matters too. And if you want more real-life stories that touch the heart and restore your faith in humanity, make sure you're subscribed to Drama Diaries Speech Alone Open Book. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.